Smoke after the little scene in the lobby. We all parted and no one spoke for a while though. When the time came, everyone was gathered into the kitchen. I was one of the last ones to walk in and I awkwardly sat on the chair at the end of the long table. A huge feast was set out on the table and my eyes hungrily gazed over it. I glanced up at Tate in the process, who sat across me on the other side of the room. The table was that long: Colin, Tom, Dale, Roger, Eddie, Joseph, and my father Jonathan. Also sat around the table. It was a full house. Once everyone was seated, no one spoke. It irritated me how I seemed to be the one who always broke the silence. If only I got $1 for every time. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" was what I had managed to blurt out. Dale choked on the pea he had threw into his mouth and fell into a coughing fit. All eyes shifted to his and still no one spoke. But Eddie glanced at me and his small figure shook slightly as he tried to conceal his laughter. "Sorry," Dale said hoarsely as he cleared his throat. I narrowed my eyes at him and felt my cheeks go red as I looked down at my lap in embarrassment. What did that woman mean? Tate suddenly asked in a gruff tone about Elina. He finished, asking the question on everyone's mind as he stared intently at Jonathan. I heard Colin sigh as he leaned back in his chair and looked into his glass. I glanced at him in curiosity as he stared intently at the cup and looked like he was lost in a memory. "Strange, I do not know. But if she means harm to my daughter, I will have her gone." Jonathan spoke lowly as he stared right back at Tate. Tate slowly nodded and gave Jonathan a look that left me suspicious. Now what exactly did he mean by gone son? Roger cut in and glanced sharply at Tate. I passed down the alpha position knowing you are very capable of running this place. But if certain people are causing, before Roger could finish, Tate shook his head and silenced his father. "No. I have it under control, no harm will be done," Tate said with determination as his eyes found mine. I sighed and grabbed the glass of water near my plate and drank it all at once. "You have it under control." Dale snorted once he recovered from his coughing fit. "Are you sure about that? The amount of shit, Dale?" Tate growled as he turned sharply to face his brother. Colin slammed his cup onto the table and sharply leaned forward, making me jump a little. Ladies, please not in front of the guests." Colin scowled. "Ladies," Eddie called out as he looked at his brothers in horror, and Tom snickered behind his hand. I opened my mouth to speak, but an intense pain in the side of my head made me stop. I clenched my teeth as signs of a headache made me rub my temple. "My daughter," Jonathan interrupted as he looked at Tate with firm eyes. "If she is not safe here, I will have to take her back with me." My eyes snapped to Jonathan's and I opened my mouth to speak once again, but Tate's loud growl made me pause. "No." Tate growled sharply and I rubbed the side of my head as the pain returned. "Tate," I tried, but his focus was directed to my father. "She goes nowhere, she stays here with me." Tate growled possessively and I flinched when the glass in his hand shattered as the force of his fist was way too strong. "Son, calm down," Roger said softly as he glanced at Tate with a frown. Alpha, I soon found myself not being able to listen. My ears began ringing and a wave of exhaustion washed over me, making my breath hitch. I said no. Someone yelled and my vision blurred, not allowing me to see who it was. I felt paralyzed and it scared me. I blinked my eyes repeatedly and picked up my glass, hoping a cool beverage would make me feel better, only to find it empty. By now shouts and growls were heard around the room. I stood up from my chair, needing the noise to stop, only to stumble, and I grabbed the chair for balance. The empty glass in my hand slipped from my grip and it shattered as soon as it made contact on the floor. Almost immediately the noise vanished and I sighed in relief at the little moment of silence. My eyes closing on their own accord. "Elina." A concerned voice called out and the scrap of a chair was heard. Was it Tate, Tom, maybe Colin? I couldn't tell. However, I didn't have time to find out. I felt my body descend to the ground and muscular arms were there to catch me as a world of darkness welcomed me. The smell of hand sanitizer made the first of my senses wake. Then it was my mouth, tasting the dryness of it, and then it was my ears. Stress, way too much stress. An unfamiliar voice said, and I squinted as my eyes adjusted to the room's light. Immediately I recognized the place as the committee's infirmary. I inwardly cringed as I suddenly found the smell of hand sanitizer too overwhelming. I glanced around, only to find Tate talking with a woman dressed in all white. She had wrinkles by her eyes, and her thin gray hair was neatly tied back. I spotted a glass near the vanity that stood in the single bed I laid in. Reaching over, I quietly grabbed it as Tate spoke to the woman. I searched for a jug of water and spotted it on the other side of the room. I was about to make a move to go grab it, but I came to a halt as a small smirk spread onto my lips. Now there's no need for that. I lifted up my palm and motioned it to the cup I held in my other hand. Almost immediately it filled up with water, and I quickly moved my palm away as it overflowed from the edges. "You should be resting." I jumped and spilled the water some more as my head snapped up, only to see Tate beside my bed. "Ed, let me." He gently whispered as he placed a hand onto my back and pulled me up as he brought the cup to my lips. The cool water slid down my throat, and I closed my eyes for a second as the water worked its way down my throat. Seconds later, I felt myself regain my energy. "What happened?" I asked him as he sat on the corner of the bed. I noticed the woman had left, so I sat up and faced Tate, his eyes never leaving mine. "You passed out," he whispered and looked away from me. I frowned as I noticed his hazel eyes darker than usual and his jaw clenched. "What is it?" I asked with furrowed eyebrows as I gently placed a hand on his cheek so he could look at me. "I can't seem to keep you safe," he said in a low tone, but his eyes were hard. Tate looked away from me again, and my hand fell limply to my side, making my frown widen. "Tate," I cooed softly, "it's not your fault. I never asked for you to keep me safe. So please don't feel. That's my job, Elina." Tate growled as his gaze snapped back to mine, and I flinched at the tone of his voice. "It's my job as your alpha, and better yet, as your mate." He insisted, and I stayed quiet. "But no matter what I do or say, you're constantly unsafe, and—" Tate trailed off, "and it scares me. It scares me because I love you, Elina," Tate said, clasping my hand tightly as his soft brown hair fell onto his forehead. As soon as I comprehended what he had said, I stopped breathing. My whole body forgot how to function, and my heart began melting as his grip on my hands tightened. He said he loved me, loved me. Those simple words left me breathless. I didn't know what to say, but I knew. I knew I loved him too, but before I told him that, I needed to feel his lips on mine. I wrapped my arms around Tate's neck and slammed his lips against mine. Immediately, Tate's strong arms grabbed me by the waist and pulled me towards him. His soft lips mended with mine, and I pushed harder, feeling the urgency. I tangled my hands into his hair, and Tate placed his hand onto the back of my neck to hold my face close. The kiss felt ecstatic. The kiss was what I could only describe as passionate. Needful love, smoky, smoky. My eyes snapped open, and the perfect moment was shattered as I pulled away from Tate, and a cough bubbled up in my throat. "Can I?" coughed. "Can you smell that?" Tate leaned back, and his dark, lustful eyes cleared as he sniffed the air around him. His arms tightened around my body, and his head snapped to the doorway. "Smoke," he growled. I looked over to where he was looking, and I gasped as clouds of smoke seeped through the door and into the room. Tate quickly pulled me out of the bed and backed the two of us away from the door. "Tate," I gasped as flames erupted on the frame of the door, and Tate growled loudly, holding me to his chest. Suddenly, a silhouette appeared behind the smoke and flames, and I found myself coughing hysterically as smoke invaded my lungs. "Elina," Tate growled as he held my chin and made me look at him. Tate wasn't affected by the smoke, and I mentally scowled at myself to man up. "You are a werewolf, Elina, and elemental too." I stifled a cough and stood up straight, giving Tate a reassuring look. I narrowed my eyes at the silhouette that hid behind the flames. Lifting my hand up, I allowed water to move freely out of my hand, and the flames hissed as it died down, allowing the shadow to be in plain sight. I gasped at the person standing in the doorway. "No." Tate's arms tightened around me as he growled, "Lily." I whispered with so much disappointment and disbelief. "How can she even? You have got to be fucking kidding me." Tate growled in a deadly tone. "Surprise, surprise," Lily said as she smiled her mean smile. I remember when the Barbie juniors at school walked past us, she'd give that exact smile. Ouch, how I trailed off in shock. I was left speechless and forgot how to speak. Tate, however, was completely in control. Whether it was him or his wolf, I had no idea. He marched up to Lily with loud growls. Lily's face transformed, and now a sultry look passed onto her face and I clenched my jaw, grinding my teeth. Did she seriously just give my mate a suggestive look? My, if it isn't my favorite alpha wolf. Lily purred and my jaw dropped open. Lily. The Lily I knew didn't flirt shamelessly with men. On instinct I stepped towards Tate as my eyes didn't leave Lily's. You shouldn't have just done that. Tate growled as he glanced around the smoke that was in the air and making it harder to breathe. There was only so much a wolf can take. Oh, what this? Lily asked in an innocent tone as she tilted her head. A second later she shot her hands out in front of her and a ball of fire flew out towards me. I gasped and quickly opened my palm and water hit her fireball. Tate growled again and pounced on Lily, his nails extending into claws. Lily squealed in surprise and fell onto her back. Tate grabbed a hold of her hands and twisted them behind her back so she couldn't shoot out fire. However, the room was already on fire and the smoke made it hard to see. Tate kept Lily's hands behind her back as she screamed and struggled. I, on the hand, used this time to extinguish the room that was burning at a fast rate. However, every time I put out a flame, it just made more smoke appear. The room was hard to see and my eyes began to water as a cough bubbled up in my throat. Elina, Tate called out, worried. Elina, are you alright? Tate yelled out. I heard a thud that sounded suspiciously like a body and Lily's cries vanished. Tate appeared by my side and he wrapped his arms around me and pushed my face into his chest. Covering me from the smoke, did you kill her? I asked in horror as I made out Lily's figure limply on the floor. No, Tate said gruffly. Not yet, I need answers. Not yet. The sound of hurried footsteps made Tate's head snapped towards the door. He growled loudly in warning as a figure rushed inside. Who's there? Tate called out in a deadly tone as he pushed me behind his back and took a step forward. It's me. Colin called back as his blurry figure entered the room and he coughed. What the fuck happened here? I opened my mouth to answer, but I breathed in a whole lot of smoke and I started coughing violently. I felt myself being picked up and the warmth of Tate made me calm down a little. Quick, get her out. Colin's voice held a tone of urgency. Tate followed Colin out with me in his arms and I heard cussing as the halls too were covered in smoke, making it hard to see. Here goes nothing, Colin muttered as he held his hands out, making me confused. What the hell are you doing? Tate yelled as he abruptly stopped. Looking back at his uncle, Colin didn't reply and closed his eyes. He held out his hands and stood there. Suddenly the air around us picked up and the smoke started swirling around. My coughs died down as I watched in shock. The smoke slowly started fading and seconds later it disappeared and I slowly eased onto my feet. Tate and I stared at Colin in shock. Still got it in me. He smirked and rubbed his palms together. Please don't tell me your eye trailed off. The air elemental? Colin inquired with a sheepish smile. Guilty as charged, she's waking up. I whispered and stepped forward, but Tate roughly pushed me behind him. Tate and Colin tied Lily up. They literally wrapped her on a chair and tied her hands so they were dangling in a bucket of ice water. Her feet were also tied up and her head hung loosely, her face facing the sky, considering we were by the lake just in case. Despite what she did, I felt bad for the position she was in. After all, she was my best friend for a long time. The shock of Colin being an elemental was still raw. However, Tate vowed we'd discuss that later on. What the Lily murmured and slowly lifted her head. Her eyes slowly opened and her blonde hair laid unattractively on her shoulders. Lily's confused eyes searched around the forest in confusion and her eyes blazed in fury when they fell on me. Why am I not surprised? Lily spat and glanced down at her hands and feet in fury. Found yourself another guard dog, did you? Always the damsel in distress. Lily sneered and Tate snapped as he appeared in front of her in inhuman speed and grabbed her by the throat. I gasped as he pulled Lily up with a growl and the chair tilted back onto its heels. Tate! I was cut off by his fearful growl. Lily's eyes were open wide in horror and she stared at Tate in panic. Tate! Colin cooed and gently pulled Tate away from Lily as she gasped for air. I wouldn't bother, I mean. Who's the one tied up in a chair? He snorted and Lily glared at him. I could always shift into my wolf, what then? Lily sneered in a hoarse voice and I cut in. You would have the moment you opened your eyes. Obviously you figured out you can't use your powers in wolf form. I said in a monotone voice as I stared intently at the girl I called my friend. I knew her too well putting that aside. Colin said in a bored tone as Tate wrapped his arms around my waist and held me close. Tell us, Colin said as he walked around behind Lily's chair and softly placed his hands on her shoulders. How is it that you, Colin said, slowly building suspense, hold the powers of the fire elemental? The same one dear Elina so delightfully drained the blood of. I looked away when he said that, but from the corner of my eye I saw Lily swiftly glance at me and gulp. Like I would tell you. She spat and Colin squeezed her shoulders, making her cry out in pain. Wrong answer, try again, he whispered by her ear. No, she said. Tate growled. If you would like, I could get my dear nephew to handle this his way. Colin shrugged as he walked around to stand near us. Though his the messy type blood and all that, Colin said casually as he pretended to check his nails. He successfully scared Lily as she squirmed in her seat. When an elemental dies, their power goes to someone like them. Someone of the same ambitions and same at heart. She spat. Obviously you haven't done your study. Not so smart now, 𝐿𝐻𝐻𝐬. Lily chuckled meanly as she targeted her gaze towards me. Colin laughed loudly and all our gazes snapped to his. Oh my. Colin laughed and wiped away a fake tear as his expression suddenly turned hard and angry. Listen here, you stupid Barbie-looking piece of shit. Colin sneered and his voice changed instantly, making my jaw drop. Tate let out a humorous snort and looked at his uncle with raised eyebrows. You think we're stupid and you're so fucking smart. Colin growled loudly. Well then, did you know that when the water elemental dies, aka Elina, all the other elementals die? He sneered and Lily's mouth shut tight. My eyes widened at the piece of information and I stumbled slightly, but Tate held on to me. You're lying. Lily shot back, but the confidence in her voice wavered. I found this a great time to step in, maybe, I said casually, trying to keep my voice strong. But would you really risk it? Do you hate me that much to risk yourself to death? I asked, and Lily remained quiet for a few moments. Yes, I do hate you, she said with so much confidence. I had to admit it, it hurt deeply, but not so much to risk your own life, I said lowly, and we all stayed quiet for a few seconds. You're right, I wouldn't risk it, she said boldly and glared up at me. But I do hate you, in fact I despise you. You were always everyone's first choice and me. She sneered. There was no me. No one gave a shit about me. She all but screamed, and I was taken aback by her words. So kill me, get it over and done with pleasure. Tate growled and extended his claws. But I stepped in front of him and he came to a halt. I turned my head to face Lily. No. I won't let you get killed because I'm not you. Our friendship might not have mattered to you, but it did to me, I said quietly. Untie her and let her leave. But Lily, I promise you, if you disturb us again, I will personally kill you. What, no? Tate growled, but I grabbed his hands and looked up intently at him. Tate stared back for a moment and let out an angry sigh, and he nodded at Colin. Tate was angry that I could tell. Fine. Just this one time. But if someone else dares to hurt you one more time, Tate said, shaking in anger as he held up one finger. Dash one more fucking time. I will have their head cut off and their body fed to vultures. Rough. After the Lily drama, things died down a bit. Colin didn't go into further depth about him being an elemental, and we didn't push it. Jonathan, my father, was staying at the werewolf committee for a few more days. As alpha, he had to get back to his duties as well as Tate. Jonathan, however, gave me space. He knew I was going through a lot and he didn't want to add to that. Tate, on the other hand, suggested the others could spread word that I was Luna. He wanted things to be somewhat normal. I told him I didn't want to have a huge get-together to announce it, and surprisingly he simply nodded. Back at the woods, I untied Lily and told her to leave. It was hard to face the situation, but I knew I didn't have it in me to hurt her. But I had the strength to get her out of my life. Soon after, I harassed Colin with questions. The air elemental was amongst us this whole time, and yet we had no clue. However, before I even got answers, Tate didn't allow Colin to speak, as he demanded I stop worrying and live a normal life. It was hard considering I was the water elemental and according to Colin, the lives of the other elementals laid heavy on my shoulders. Talk about pressure. So here I was taking a walk on the opposite side of the committee where the pack and high wolves stayed. Tate had work to catch up on and people had their lives to go on with. I wasn't really in the mood to attend class, so why not aimlessly wander around? Excuse me. A head appeared in the emptiness of the halls and I was greeted by a girl with red hair and numerous freckles. Yes, I answered as politely as I could. I wasn't exactly in the mood to socialize. I'm looking for someone. She trailed off and glanced around. I'm not familiar with this place, but I have to find someone for. She paused. A group of friends. Oh. I said, regretting I came to this part of the committee. I'm not very familiar myself, Elina. She cut in and I froze at my name. I kept my face emotionless and stared back at her in question. Do you know anyone by that name? I can't find anyone out of the bloody classrooms to ask. She mumbled the last part, then looked up at me. Waiting for a reply, no, and Elina. What kind of name is that? I chuckled nervously. Play it cool, Elina. No, sorry. Why did you need her? I asked in curiosity. After all the danger I've been put in, I think I know not to tell a stranger my name. Want some candy, kid? I mentally said as I thought of an old man holding candy out towards me. I physically shuddered. None of your business. The girl suddenly snapped. She didn't bother sparing me another glance as she spun on her heel and rushed away. I couldn't help but feel a little anxious. But of course it was nothing. Perhaps she was just curious who the Luna was, right? Yeah, that had to be it. It's not like another group of people wanted me dead. Glancing at the empty space the girl had been, I spun around and rushed away. It was stupid. But I was wary about my surroundings and most of the time I wanted to be in Tate's arms. Shielded away from the harsh world. Alright, I lied. I wanted that all the time. At the mere thought of Tate, my body automatically directed itself towards his office. I knew the halls like the back of my hand and I made my way towards the office with eagerness. Not really knocking. I slowly opened the door and stepped inside. Tate's chair was vacant and that made me frown. However, remembering his chamber, I walked over to the bookshelf lining the back wall and pushed it aside. The stairs came into view and I slowly made my way down them. Reaching the bottom, I almost gasped. Tate was beside his bed shirtless. I've seen him shirtless before, sure. But now I was caught off guard and hadn't had the chance to tell myself how to breathe. Tate's back was facing me, but must have hearing me his back tensed. A small growl was heard, then a second later he spun around with dark eyes. Spotting my slightly frozen state, he sighed. His eyes immediately went back to their beautiful shade of hazel. I inwardly sighed. You surprised me, he said lowly, his eyes not leaving mine. You or me? I quietly mumbled as my gaze drifted off to his bare chest. Tate didn't say anything and gave me a small grin. He sat down onto his bed and leaned back. Hands behind head. Are you just going to stand there? Tate asked with a hint of a smirk and I raised an eyebrow. However, I didn't argue. Who would? I willingly walked over and slipped into the bed. Beside him, he didn't speak and I didn't either. I was famous for doing stupid things. I didn't know if this was one of them, but I hoisted myself up on an elbow and faced Tate. He had his eyes closed. His forehead was slightly creased and I frowned. If someone had to stop worrying, it was him. I leaned forward and placed a soft kiss on his forehead. Immediately his features relaxed and he remained still. I placed another kiss on the side of his face and made my way down to his lips. Soon as our lips made contact, it was as if the beast in him came alive. His fingers roughly tangled into my hair and pulled my face closer to his, not knowing physically how. But now I was lying flat on my back and Tate was hovering over me with his eyes closed and his breath fanning my lips. I was surprised by his rough movements. Before I could even wonder out loud or even speak, Tate's lips crashed down onto mine once again with brutal force. It was weird. His movements were rough, but still he managed to make his touch loving and passionate. Not that I was complaining really. Who was I to complain? Growl. I was currently tucked under Tate. He hovered over me on his elbows and attacked my lips. I felt like an idiot just laying there under him. So I wrapped my arms around his neck and pulled his chest down onto mine. I heard Tate growl lowly in the back of his throat as he pushed harder on my lips. I felt his left hand trail down the side of my body and rest on my hip. I quietly moaned in satisfaction, and his grip on my waist tightened as I fisted my hands into his hair. This felt nice. The sensation was indescribable, and all I felt was tingles and rainbows and, "Tate, where are you, man?" A voice shouted from outside of the chamber from inside Tate's office. I groaned as the moment shattered. I leaned away from Tate's lips and glanced over at the chamber's staircase. Tate, however, ignored the voice and was quite comfortable in his room. He moved forward towards my retreated lips, and I melted instantly, forgetting the voice. "Brother, are we playing hide and seek?" Dale's familiar voice called out. Tate's hand slipped into my shirt. "I can smell your scent, but..." "Hey, what's this?" Tate's hand slowly massaged the soft flesh of my waist. "You have a secret underground brothel and didn't bother to tell me." My shirt began to rise over my stomach. However, both mine and Tate's movements stilled as the sounds of struggle and pain echoed the room. I glanced over in time to see Dale's hunched figure rolling down the stairs. He hit the stone floor and huffed as he stood up. "If I wasn't a werewolf, I swear." Dale stopped talking, and his mouth stayed open in surprise as he took in mine and Tate's intimate position. I groaned in embarrassment and sunk further into the mattress. "Well, this is rather interesting." Dale grinned but must have noticed Tate's deadly glare. Dale coughed and then cleared his throat. He glanced at me, and Tate growled, telling him it was time to leave. "All right, okay, you two wanna, Dale?" I said awkwardly and gave him a tight smile. "Could you leave?" "Well, that sounded rude." Dale's hands shot out in surrender. However, he didn't say another word and all but raced out of Tate's chamber. I turned to my side to see Tate sigh and cover his face. The blanket lightly draped across his waist. I licked my lips at the sight. "Call me a pervert if you want." I leaned forward and kissed his bare chest. Not seeing his reaction, I also let out a sigh and rested my head on his chest. "I almost forgot to mention," I suddenly said. Tate remained silent, and I took that as a sign to continue. "I met a girl today." "Well, not really. She asked me if I knew an Elina." I said no, of course. "I mean, after everything." I trailed off and glanced up at Tate. A small frown overtook his lips, and immediately I felt bad. "It's probably nothing," I quickly rushed out. "Words out, I am your mate, that's why. But I thought I'd tell you just in case, because..." I was silenced by his lips covering mine. "Let's hope that's the only reason," he mumbled when he pulled back, offering me a soft smile. After Tate and I stayed in his room for longer than necessary. We both left to go to the main lobby. It was amazing how much you can find out in such a short time. Something like Roger and Eddie leaving to visit another pack. Completely out of topic, but also saddening. I needed a little Eddie to remind me how cool my elemental powers were. Tate and I entered the main lobby and spotted several figures near the door. Imagine my surprise when I saw my father Jonathan and my uncle Joseph patting Colin and the others on the back saying goodbye. "What's going on?" I asked anxiously as I rushed forward. Jonathan looked over at me and gave me a sad smile. "Elina, there you are," he said in adoration as he walked over and wrapped his arms around me. I smiled slightly and hugged him back. "Where are you guys going?" I asked, trying to smile but couldn't help but grimace. I knew automatically they were leaving Elina. "You know, as Alpha, I have responsibilities," he began, and I sighed, looking at the ground. "However, your happiness is my top priority. I want to get to know you, and I know you want to get to know me, so," Jonathan said, clearing his throat as he glanced at Joseph. "I want you to come back with me." Took me a second to comprehend what he said. When my mind finally registered what he had said, I looked at him in surprise. I opened my mouth to answer, but like always, someone bet me to it. "No, this was not a part of the plan," Tate growled. "Suddenly by my side you came. You had your little D&M and then you left gone." "Nada," he growled, suddenly sounding very angry. Jonathan glared at Tate and he opened his mouth to speak, but this time Colin cut in. "Tate, calm down. Does your throat never hurt from all that growling?" Colin asked, genuinely curious as he rubbed his throat self-consciously. "I can never keep it up for so long, true talent, son." We all stared at him, right back to the point. There is no need for conflict, as the answer is simple. The choice is up to Elina. She goes where she wants to go. I could have drowned Colin right there. All pairs of eyes turned to me, oh boy. Worry. I held my father's gaze for a little longer, then shifted my gaze towards my mate, Tate. As much as I wanted to go with my dad and get to know him, I wanted to stay with Tate more. Tate needed me. My father might have as well, but my love for Tate was way too strong. I sighed and almost grimaced at my father's hopeful look. I want to get to know you, I really do, I said with a pause as everyone remained silent. But I began but was cut off. Buts are always a bad sign. Dale sighed softly as he shook his head, watching from the corner. I saw Tate shoot him a look, and immediately he became silent. I can't go, not now, but I promise I will soon. I tried my best to reject his offer as politely as I possibly could. However, I felt guilty when I saw the hopeful look from his eyes disappear. Immediately, Jonathan straightened up and cleared his throat. All right, that's fine as long as you're happy, he said with a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Joseph and I must be on our way now. Thank you for your services, Jonathan said, giving Tate a nod. However, Tate still seemed pissed from before and simply stood there unmoving. I took a few steps forward and looked up at my dad, memorizing his face. Jonathan seemed to do the same before he opened his arms wide and engulfed me in an embrace as our audience stayed silent. Take care of yourself, he whispered in my ear. Squeezing my shoulders, he finally let go, and I gave him a sad smile as he left through the double wooden doors. Exiting the committee, Joseph, my uncle, lingered back for a few moments. It was great meeting you, Elina, but like your father said, we have to go. But if you need any help, if you're in any trouble and need the earth elemental around, Joseph said with a grin as he pointed to himself. You call me straight away. I let out a small laugh and without warning gave my uncle a hug. I couldn't help but think that I have a really cool family, one that I'll see soon. Joseph gave me one last smile before he left, following my father once they were out of sight. The wooden doors were slammed shut and Colin dusted his hands. Wasn't that lovely? Anyone fancy some tea? Colin asked with a grin as he held up his cup that held something that smelt suspiciously like alcohol. My gaze drifted off to his glass, and I'm guessing so did everyone else's. Oh, this don't mind me, I'll be in the kitchen, Colin said and spun around to leave. Colin, I called out before he went too far. Humming, he spun around. Can I speak to you for a second? I asked. It seemed like he already knew what I was going to say. He grimaced and nodded his head. Dale left the room and I looked around to see it was just Tate. Colin and I, we held the conversation off for a long while. The day Lily, the new fire elemental, decided to try and burn me alive. We found out Colin was the air elemental. What is it? Colin asked with a tight smile. Why didn't you tell us you were the air elemental? Tate automatically said, reading my mind. I didn't see the need to. You didn't see the need to? Tate asked his uncle in disbelief and anger. I placed a hand on his arm to keep him calm. What the hell do you mean you didn't see the need to? Tate growled when Colin stayed silent. Don't push it any further, Tate, it doesn't matter, Colin said firmly, his playful mood gone. Colin, I said in a quiet voice, please. Colin looked over at me, then glanced at Tate. Fine. Colin sighed and looked into his cup. There are some werewolves and humans that know about elementals. For a long time, even before you were born, they were set on killing the elementals, especially the water elemental. At his words, I gulped, and I noticed Tate's body pressed up behind me and his arms wrapped around my waist protectively. And Tate pressed. And being an elemental, I didn't want the whole world to know I was the bloody air elemental. I didn't control the air and kept it a secret. Then eventually I never thought about it. Nowadays there's rarely groups of hunters for elementals, Colin explained casually as he shrugged his shoulders, and I looked at him with wide eyes. Is Elina in danger? Tate growled and practically ignored everything else he said. Well, I don't think so. Like I said, there is rarely groups of hunters today. That's not good enough, Tate said sharply, and I let out a huff of air, pulling away from him. All right, guys, I think that's enough for one day, I said with a nervous laugh. Colin tilted his head and gave me a small grin. Come on, Tate, I said, linking my arm into Tate's and pulling him towards the door. Tate didn't move and clenched his jaw. I looked over to see Colin disappear from the room. I sighed and faced Tate. I put my hands up and cupped his face into my palms. I leaned forward and gently pressed my lips onto his. "Come," I whispered onto his lips on. I pecked his lips again and leaned back. Tate tried to fight off the small grin on his face, but I saw it and let out a laugh. I smiled and Tate put my hand into his. He placed his other hand behind my neck and placed his lips onto mine again so they could move in sync. "This is nice," I whispered. "It is not having to worry." I sighed and closed my eyes. "Let's hope it lasts long." Tate mumbled and leaned his head onto mine. "Yeah. I thought, let's hope so, hunters." A few days later, the sun was out. It was lovely. Eddie played with his toy cars and made car engine noises, and I laughed when he made them crash. "Did you see that, Elina? How cool." He yelled out with a large smile. "Yeah, very cool." I told Tate's little brother with a chuckle. "He's a good kid, isn't he?" Colin said from beside me, and I nodded. "Yeah, he is." "And a pain in the neck." Tate mumbled, and I rolled my eyes. Dale was leaning on a nearby tree and let out a snort as he glanced over at Tate. "The usual ray of sunshine, aren't we, Tate?" He snickered. "Hilarious," Tate mumbled, making Colin laugh. "Boys, boys. Please be a little bit more mature like Eddie." We all stayed silent for a few moments and watched Eddie play and laugh. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts, but the day was peaceful. Tom left the grounds to visit family, and Roger was helping out a pack in the East region. So it was peaceful until an arrow was shot into my leg. "What the hell?" I cried out and glanced down. An arrow was sticking out of my back leg, and I groaned in pain. Tate growled and was in front of me in a flash. He pulled out the arrow and I hissed at the pain. Immediately it started healing. Tate snapped his head to the direction the arrow came from. Colin and Dale rushed to stand in front of us all. Tate signaled his little brother over, and Eddie ran in front to play hero, but Tate grabbed him by the scruff of his collar and pulled him behind us. Everyone stayed silent for a few seconds, listening out for any noise. In seconds we were in a defensive position, and I worriedly scanned the area. 𝐾𝐜𝐬𝐬𝐿. Colin cooed to the empty landscape. However, we all could hear the shuffling around due to our advanced hearing. That's why we weren't surprised when a group of 5 people holding weapons emerged from the trees. I felt Colin stiffen, and I turned over to see him looking at the group with a mean glare. "They're elemental hunters," Colin whispered through his teeth. On instinct, Tate grabbed my arm and pulled me to his side. "That's her," a redhead called out. I let my gaze drift to hers and immediately recognized her. She was the girl who asked if I knew an Elina. More specifically me. "Are you sure?" a man asked as he held a crossbow at eye level, resting the weapon on his shoulder. "Yes. She has the same description the Lily girl told us." I took in a sharp intake of breath. "Hello," Tate called out in a growl. "Sorry to break your mother's club, but you're on my territory," he hissed in a dangerous voice. The group of elemental hunters didn't waver. In fact, they took a step closer and raised their weapons. Colin sighed and took a step forward with his hands held up, ready to talk. However, an arrow flew over his head in warning. Colin froze and glanced behind him and back at the group. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered. "You really shouldn't have done that," he yelled out and chuckled like a maniac. The group ignored his words, and all at the same time they positioned their weapons, and all at once numerous arrows were thrown at the same time. I gasped and pushed Eddie behind me to shield him and closed my eyes. However, feeling a change in the wind, I cracked one eye open to see Colin's hand up in the air, his palm facing outwards. All the arrows slowed down, and before they could touch us, stilled in the air, Colin closed his palm and all the arrows dropped to the floor. One called out in disbelief, "There's another one. Kill that one and the rest go down too." The man growled and shot another arrow at me. It flew through the wind at incredible speed, and before I could react, Tate's arm shot out and caught the arrow, squeezing his palm with a growl, crumbled and fell to the floor. "I suggest you don't waste your time," Tate said in a calm voice, but his eyes were deadly. "I suggest you shut the hell up," the man who threatened to kill me yelled. I slapped a hand over my mouth. He really shouldn't have said that. He just told an alpha to shut up. Tate's body tensed. He glanced down and took in a sharp intake of breath, getting really mad now. He glanced down and back up again. The group of elemental hunters lowered their weapons slightly, and a few gasped. I looked over to see Tate's eyes glowing yellow. His wolf was at bay and he wasn't doing anything to hide it. Turn around and leave, Tate hissed, or stay. And I shift and kill you all. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. We're not afraid of you. The same man said, however. He looked a lot more hesitant. Henry, the red-headed girl, whispered, I don't have a death wish. The rest of the group murmured in agreement. Before we knew it, they took several steps back. Their heads down in submission. What are you doing? Henry whispered, outraged. Sorry, Henry. But we don't stand a chance. And just like that, the leader was abandoned. Cowards. He screamed behind him. He spun back around in rage and aimed his arrow. Do you really want to go down that road? Dale said, his voice holding a tone of false sympathy. Can't we just kill him? Eddie spat in disgust as he glared at the man, his little frame beside me. The enraged man swiftly shifted his aim to Eddie and every single one of us growled. Hey, hey, I yelled and stepped in front of Eddie. Did he just go there? He just went there. Without a second thought, I opened my palm and raised it in the air. I flicked my wrist to the left, and without warning, a burst of water shot out and hit the man with brutal force as he slammed into a tree. He cried out in pain and grunted as he fell to the floor. His face now masked alarm as he searched hysterically for his crossbow. Spotting it, he crawled forward to retrieve it, but Colin's boot crashed down on his hand and squashed it into the earth's soil. Mother fu! Colin twisted his foot, the man's hand turning with it. The man screamed in agony and I grimaced at the noise. Like music to my ears, Colin hummed with a grin. He pulled his foot back and the man named Henry slowly stood up, cradling his hand as he clenched his jaw. I'll be back, he hissed. You'll regret this, he yelled before turning around and running away into the trees. Should I go hunt him down? Dale asked with an excited tone of voice. No. He can't do anything really, Colin said with a shrug. I let out a shaky breath and Tate sighed, taking me into his arms. Dale, go get the warrior wolves for me. Either they're fucking stupid or those hunters are good. He gritted and I leaned my head onto his chest. What happens if he comes back? Couldn't help but ask. I wouldn't see him as a threat, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. Colin shrugged and I nodded my head. Gone. Tate and most of the other male wolves were gone, because they were out resetting the positions the warrior wolves were to be put in. With them all gone, I was in complete and utter boredom. However, I went on my search to find Colin, as he was the only one who decided to stay back. Just as I was about to pass the kitchen, I heard more than just Colin's voice. I went to walk in and only took one step in when I froze. There stood the hunter, but this time he held a gun. Again, that was pointed at Colin. Colin stood there with his hands up in mock surrender, one hand up in the air, and the other holding his glass of alcohol. Common Harold, Colin sighed in an impatient tone. He then tilted his head and furrowed his eyebrows. Harold was or was it Howard Harry Henry? The hunter gritted and I tried my best to not make a sound. What do I do? Walk and scream, laugh, right, Henry? You came here to kill me? Colin asked in amusement, and the elemental hunter stayed silent. However, Colin sighed and kept speaking. But seriously, a gun. I don't want to die such a cliché death. Colin muttered to himself. I see we have company, was all the hunter said. I stopped breathing. My eyes adverted to Colin, who clenched his jaw. He knew I was there from the beginning and hoped the hunter hadn't noticed. Why isn't he using his powers? Looks like I can kill all you elementals at once, the hunter said with a grin, and I narrowed my eyes at him as I fully walked into the room. I quickly lifted my hand up to release water towards the hunter, but nothing happened. I frowned and tried again. What the? I trailed off in question as I looked at Colin in alarm. Harold, over here, released a toxic in the air. It paralyzes our abilities, Colin said calmly. I took in a sharp intake of breath. I read about this toxic. It doesn't wear off for a couple of hours. Closing my eyes, I willed myself to shift. That didn't work either. All our abilities, Colin said with a tight smile as his eyes didn't leave the hunter's. The hunter must have grew restless to our talking, because with a grunt, he pulled the gun's safety trigger and I froze, holding my breath yet again. I sent Colin a look. We both knew this wasn't going to end well, and I gave him a look that I wasn't sure he understood. However, he sent me a nod of understanding. I looked back at the man who raised his gun and slowly aimed it at me. My eyes flickered back to Colin. I was unsure of what to do. Any sudden movement could make the man pull the trigger. Colin must have seen the terror in my eyes because his face hardened and his gaze drifted off to the man, and he sent him a glare as a low growl rumbled in his throat. The man seemed more alert, and without waiting another second, he clutched onto the gun tighter and pressed the trigger. It was like in the movies. Everything happened in slow motion. The bullet flew towards me and my heart skipped a beat. However, in just half a second, Colin was in front of me and clutching my arm. He pulled me behind him. Past his shoulder, I saw him smack the gun out of the man's hand. However, the damage had already been done. My hands clasped over my mouth as I gasped in horror. Colin's weight slowly weighed down onto mine, and my hands automatically went under his armpits to hold him up. I slowly stepped back as I placed his weight onto the floor. I looked down in shock. My heart broke at the sight. Blood. Colin was bleeding. A bullet wound in his chest. Colin, I whispered in horror. He simply wheezed in a breath and with panic in his eyes, averted his gaze to the man. My head snapped towards the hunter and I saw him frantically searching for the gun. Immediately I saw red with a loud, earth-shaking growl. I spotted the gun with no trouble and picked it up. My hands shook viciously as I pointed it to the man. Tears clouded my vision and I was breathing heavily. Son of a bitch, I roared in rage. The man stood up straight and looked at Colin with a grin. I growled even more, don't look at him. I screamed with the gun unsteadily in my hands. The man's eyes drifted up to mine and he rolled his eyes. Too bad I was aiming at you, huh? The hunter mumbled and looked at me. I felt a hand gently clasp around my ankle. I glanced down and Colin looked up at me with heavy lids, trying to speak. However, I ignored him. Turning back around, I faced the man with a murderous look. Shaking Colin's hand off, I stomped forward. You can't do it. The man cooed as he eyed the gun with a smile. Really, I said in a low voice. Are you sure about that? I whispered. And without a second thought, I pulled the trigger. Not once, not twice, I sent bullet after bullet. I screamed as the gunshot sound went off and off. I squeezed my eyes shut and dropped the gun, clattered onto the floor, and everything stayed quiet, except Colin's struggled breaths. I slowly opened my eyes with a sob as I saw the hunter's dead body. Blood pooling on the floor, eyes wide open in shock. Bile rose up my throat. Swallowing it down, I spun around and let out a loud sob. I sped over to Colin and knelt down next to his body. My hands shakily covered the wound and I pressed down hard. Blood coating my hands. Colin, I sobbed. He got shot in the chest. Our abilities are disabled. That means no fast healing. The toxic hadn't wore off yet. And that's when panic settled in. My eyes frantically searched the room. Help. I screamed, someone help. I screamed in a hoarse voice. I felt a hand grab my wrist and take it off the wound. Elina, it's too late, Colin said breathlessly. His eyes were closed and he had a peaceful look. What? No? I yelled and my hands shakily covered his wound again, tears falling down my cheek. I hurriedly took off my jacket and bunched it up into a ball. I pressed it onto his chest. Colin, I'm gonna go get help. I blabbered nervously and Colin shook his head. Before I could do anything, a voice made me freeze. I stopped breathing. Uncle, Tate said slowly in the doorway as his eyes scanned the area, his body frozen as his eyes zoomed in on his uncle's chest. In inhuman speed, he rushed inside and knelt onto the other side of Colin. Lifting up his head, he cradled it in his lap. Uncle. Tate trailed off as he looked over at the hunter's dead body. Someone get down here now, Tate roared. No. Colin croaked, you have a death wish, Uncle. Tate growled as he moved my hands and pressed down onto the wound, trying to stop the blood as I hopelessly watched with tears. Colin grimaced, wanna see my mate leave me? Colin said with heavy lids, we can't. You said you didn't want to die a cliché death. Remember? I hurriedly said and frantically nodded my head. See, you can't die. Tate grabbed my hand from over Colin's body and gently squeezed it. Elina. Colin breathed out, don't cry, I'm happy. I can see my soulmate. He stopped and clenched his jaw, trying to breathe properly. I miss her. I stayed silent. Tate's son. Colin whispered hoarsely, out of breath. Please don't kill me for making your mate cry, even though I am already dying. He chuckled, but it came out him struggling to breath, and I sat up straight. Alarmed Colin, I said in panic, and Tate clenched his jaw and blinked furiously as his eyes got glossy with tears. You guys take care of yourselves. Colin said, his breaths shortening. No, no, no. I said, shaking my head with a sob, refusing to believe it. Thank you for everything. Colin said with a peaceful smile, his eyes slowly closing. No, Uncle, thank you. Tate whispered, thank you so much. I sobbed, and Colin's smile widened as his eyes remained closed. However, slowly his smile began to disappear. His balanced head slowly fell to the side, and just like that, his breathing shallowed and suddenly stopped. I let out a cry. Tate softly placed his uncle's head onto the floor and stood up and ran a hand through his hair with a shaky breath. Tate looked down at me, and he gave me a broken look. I slowly stood up with silent tears, and Tate balled his fist and bit down onto it. Elina, he trailed off, then let out a sigh. Come here. And I did exactly that. I ran over and threw myself into Tate's arms and cried. Tate stood there in silence and held onto me tightly, and he rested his chin onto my head and whispered sweet nothings. Only an hour ago Colin was up and alive, breathing. And now he was gone up in heaven near his mate. Life on earth doesn't last long. Happiness and laughter also doesn't, but love. Love lasts an eternity. May we bow our head in prayer. Everyone that stood by the coffin lowered their head. It was Colin's funeral, and somehow it helped make everything seem more real. It was also a week after the incident. When everyone found out about Colin's death, they didn't handle it so well. Vases were thrown, windows were shattered, and tears were shed. However, right now, everyone at the funeral stayed deadly silent as we all silently prayed. Tate stood close by my side, his shoulders grazing mine. Amen. Everyone slowly raised their heads and murmured to one another. There was quite the crowd, and I had to admit Colin must have been pretty popular. The man on the other side of the coffin gently tapped onto the microphone. We were in the woods, so everything was set up. As werewolves, it was normal for us. The woods were the place of Colin's birth, and he would have wanted it to be his place of death. Or at least where he was buried. If any speeches need to be made. The man that was also a werewolf trailed off as he gestured to the front. I thought very few would make speeches, that they were all too devastated to talk. But I thought wrong. Several people lined up to make their speeches. First it was Roger. He spoke about his brother highly and repeated many times how he was going to miss him. Then it was Dale, then Tom. Then Tate, who left my side to make a brief speech on his uncle. His face remained emotionless, but I knew he was hurting. A little grin spread across my face when Eddie sped his way to the front and went up on his tippy toes to reach the microphone. The man standing beside him also smiled and pulled it down to his height. Hi, Eddie said brightly, and a few mumbled back. This is my first funeral, so I don't know what to say, he said, and a small frown slipped onto his face. Everyone stayed silent as they all watched Eddie. Eddie glanced down, still frowning, then a moment later glanced back up with a smile. My uncle was one of the coolest people, and I've met a lot of cool people, Eddie brightly said as he glanced at me, and I smiled in return while a few people chuckled through blurry eyes. I don't know why all of you are crying so much, Eddie exclaimed with another frown. Uncle Colin is happy, and I know it. He used to always tell me he couldn't wait to go up there. Eddie pointed to the sky to see his mate. Eddie then became silent, not knowing what to say. The man next to him patted Eddie on the shoulder and gave it a squeeze with another kind smile as he put the microphone back up and leaned forward. May he rest in peace, he finished off for Eddie. Eddie looked up at him and gave the man a friendly smile before turning around and coming back near the crowd. After a few of Colin's long-lost friends gave inspirational speeches. They bid their goodbye and paid their respects before slowly leaving. The coffin was lowered, and all too soon Colin's body was underground and gone. I tightly held the bunch of flowers in my hand and stepped forward once no one was around grave. Walking near it, I placed the flowers gently on top of the soil and kneeled down with a sigh. Hey Colin, I whispered. There was no reply. I'm sorry I didn't go up and make a speech, I said with a sheepish smile even though he couldn't see me. But I just wanted you to know that I'm grateful for everything you did, I said with a smile and glanced behind me to see Tate leaning on a tree far behind me. So is Tate, I whispered. After a moment or two of silence, I stood up and dusted off my pants. Taking a few steps backwards, I ironed my gaze. Thank you for everything. Spinning around, I pulled my jacket around myself tighter as I began walking towards Tate. However, when I almost reached Tate, I felt a small change in the wind. It was only for a split second, and then there was a small whisper in the air. "You're welcome." I reached Tate and glanced behind me with furrowed eyebrows. Shaking my head, I looked back at Tate to see him staring at the ground with a blank look. "Tate," I whispered, and he looked up at me but said nothing. "Are you all right?" I said, worried. Tate blinked a few times and took in a shaky breath before nodding his head. I placed my palm on his cheek and caressed it, leaning forward to rest my forehead on his. Tate closed his eyes, and so did I. "We can have that life you wanted," I whispered. "To live happily with your mate and not have anyone trying to kill us." Tate slightly shook his head. If anything, probably not believing me. "You kept your promise." I insisted and leaned back to see Tate's hazel eyes already focused on me. "Everything's over now, we can be happy," I persisted. "Anything to see him smile, can we?" he asked, and I smiled, nodding my head. I put my arms around Tate and rested my head on his shoulder. Slowly, Tate's arms wrapped around me and he caressed my hair with one hand. "You know I love you, Elina," Tate murmured in my ear, and I hugged him tighter. "I know I love you too," I said back and leaned backwards to place a kiss on his lips. Tate held me there and slowly kissed me back. It was slow and full of passion. "Come on. We should go back inside," Tate gently said and wrapped his arm around my shoulder, pulling me to his side. We began our way back to the committee. However, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. I also couldn't help but smile. If Colin was now with his mate, that meant he feels the way I feel when I'm with Tate. That means he's happy, safe, loved. That was the thought that kept me going and smiling. When we arrived to the committee, I opened my mouth to speak and comment on the funeral. However, an overly excited Eddie came running out of the doors in a fast sprint. He tripped over and awkwardly stumbled back up before he stopped in front of us, panting. "Eddie, what's wrong?" Tate asked immediately as he knelt down in front of his little brother and placed his hands on his shoulders. Eddie blabbered out random words, and Tate furrowed his eyebrows, shaking his head. "Calm down, Eddie, breath," Tate said as he waited for a reply from Eddie. Eddie took in a dramatic breath in and then out. "Okay, now speak," Tate ordered, and Eddie squealed. "Watch, Tate," and I watched, confused. Eddie lifted up his hand and harshly swiped it through the air. Tate and I glanced at each other and looked back at Eddie strangely. However, after a moment or two, a strong current of wind suddenly appeared and hit us with such force I stumbled back a few steps. Stunned, Eddie fell backwards and landed on his backside. However, had a massive grin on his face. Tate wasn't affected by the wind and didn't even flinch. With one hand, he pulled me back and with the other pulled Eddie up. I looked at Eddie with wide eyes and slowly a small smile spread across my face. "Wait, so you're the new air elemental?" I asked Eddie in excitement, and Eddie furiously nodded his head. "Yes, it's so cool," Eddie yelled out in excitement as he clapped his hands. "I can do this." Eddie swung his hand to the left, making the breeze come from another direction. "And this?" he exclaimed again, and the wind's direction changed again. "Eddie," Tate firmly said and grabbed Eddie's hand, placing it back down to his side. "You have to learn to control it," Tate told his brother, and Eddie smiled at Tate, nodding his head. "Control the power or himself." I chuckled, and Eddie stuck his tongue out at me. "I'm gonna go tell Dale. He's gonna be so jealous," Eddie exclaimed with a cheeky grin and spun around, running back inside. Eddie disappeared back inside, and I turned around to face Tate, who ran a hand through his hair with a sigh. "Great. Now we're going to wake up to a different weather forecast every day," he mumbled, and I couldn't help but snicker. "Could be worse." I shrugged, and Tate stayed silent, looking into my eyes. I noticed the natural brightness of his eyes were missing, and he looked at me with what looked like sad eyes. Tate paused. "You said we can live happily, right?" Tate asked suddenly, and I immediately nodded my head. "Because I will be happy no matter what if you're near me." "But will you be happy?" Tate asked, his hazel eyes boring into mine as he stepped forward. "What?" I asked, tilting my head. "Yes, why wouldn't I be?" I asked, confused. Tate stepped incredibly closer to me and tilted his head so his mouth was beside my ear. "That girl Lily you called your friend is still breathing." Tate growled softly, his voice low and dangerous. "That's why," Tate added and slowly moved back, his face inches away from mine. I was taken aback by his harsh tone and I sighed, looking down. "I'll still be happy," I whispered, then looked back up with a grin. "As long as you're near me, I'll always be happy," I added with a cheesy smile, and finally Tate broke a smile. I had to hold in the sigh of relief when I saw him smile. I couldn't help but smile with him. He wrapped his arms around my waist and pulled me forward. Looking down at me with a smirk, "Oh?" he asked, and I couldn't help but smile wider. Seeing him happy, I leaned forward and without wasting another second locked lips with Tate. Tate immediately responded and pulled me towards him tighter as he kissed me back aggressively, emotion leaking into the kiss. Things would be different now. With Colin gone and everybody affected by it, things won't be the same for a while. However, I was determined to be happy now. Happy with Tate, maybe one day start a family. One day have children. The thought made me blush. However, I could definitely see a future with Tate. "Are you blushing?" I snapped out of my daze as I saw Tate was leaning back and looking at me with his head tilted. "What, you are blushing?" Tate teased, and I rolled my eyes. "I am not." "Why are you blushing?" Tate asked in a curious tone. "Tate," I exclaimed, and Tate chuckled. I couldn't fight off the smile that threatened to overcome my lips. "Fine, I'll let it go," he said with a grin. "Come, let's go inside," and so we did. Even though the day had been saddening, it was also worth going through, because at the end of the day I got to see Tate smile for longer than 10 seconds. From the start, Tate and I went through a lot of lunatic people. Surprisingly, we managed to stay sane. But there was no need to dwell on the past. Things would get better. Tate was happy and smiling, so already my goal was complete. We finally got here, stronger than ever. I was lucky to find my soulmate in life, so damn lucky to have Tate, and I wasn't planning on letting him go.